Picture this. You're a German soldier in 1945. For months, maybe years, you've been eating watery turnip soup, moldy bread, and whatever scraps you could scavenge from bombed-out buildings. Your ribs are showing. Your uniform hangs off your skeletal frame. You've watched men around you literally starve to death. The Third Reich promised you glory, but delivered only hunger and defeat. Now you're sitting in a British POW camp, expecting the worst. After all, you've heard the propaganda about what the barbaric Allies do to prisoners. You're terrified. You're weak. You're utterly broken. And then they bring you a full plate of hot food. Real meat, fresh vegetables, white bread. More food than you've seen in months. Some prisoners actually cried. Others thought it was a cruel joke, that the food must be poisoned. Many simply couldn't believe their eyes. This is the story of what happened when German prisoners of war arrived in Britain and experienced something they never expected. British decency, fair treatment, and a meal that would change how they viewed their former enemies forever. If you're ready to discover one of the most shocking and little-known stories from World War II, then make sure you hit that subscribe button right now, because what you're about to hear will completely change how you think about this war. The year is 1945. The Third Reich is collapsing. Allied forces are pushing into Germany from all sides, and German soldiers are surrendering in unprecedented numbers. Hundreds of thousands of Wehrmacht troops, SS officers, and even Hitler Youth members are being captured and transported to POW camps across Europe and beyond. But here's what makes this story remarkable. While conditions in German POW camps were notoriously brutal, where Soviet, British, and American prisoners faced starvation, disease, and systematic abuse, the British were about to do something radically different with their German captives. The Geneva Convention of 1929 had established rules for the treatment of prisoners of war. But let's be honest, by 1945, after 6 years of total war, after the Holocaust, after the Blitz, after countless atrocities, the British would have been completely justified in their hatred. These German soldiers had bombed British cities, killed British civilians, and fought to impose Nazi tyranny across Europe. Yet what happened next speaks volumes about British character and the values that the Allies were actually fighting for. Transport ships and trains brought thousands of German POWs to Britain throughout 1944 and 1945. These men arrived in various states of physical and mental deterioration. Some were wounded, many were malnourished, virtually all of them were terrified. One captured German officer, whose account was recorded in the archives of the Imperial War Museum, later wrote, "We expected to be shot, or at the very least to be starved, as we had been taught the British would do. We had been told for years that the English were cruel, that they would torture prisoners, that capture meant death." Another prisoner, a young Wehrmacht soldier, barely 20 years old, recalled, "I was so hungry when we arrived that I was eating grass from the ground during our march to the camp. I had not had a proper meal in weeks. My stomach had forgotten what it felt like to be full." The Nazi propaganda machine had spent years conditioning these men to fear capture by the Allies. They expected the worst. They anticipated revenge. They prepared themselves for cruelty equal to or greater than what had been inflicted on Allied prisoners in German camps. Instead, they got something completely unexpected. When the first groups of German POWs arrived at camps across Britain, places like Camp 174 in Featherstone Park, or the facilities in Scotland and Wales, they were processed, documented, and then fed. And not just fed with scraps or minimal rations. They were given proper, substantial meals. Let me paint a picture of what these men saw on their plates. Hot tea or coffee, fresh white bread with real butter, porridge or eggs for breakfast, and for main meals, actual meat. Beef stews, pork, chicken, potatoes, carrots, peas. Portions that would have been considered generous even for British civilians who were themselves on wartime rations. One German NCO, interviewed decades later, remembered his first meal in Britain with crystal clarity. "I thought I was hallucinating. There was meat, real meat, on the plate, vegetables that weren't rotten, bread that wasn't moldy. I looked at the British guards waiting for them to snatch it away to tell us it was a mistake, but they just nodded and told us to eat. Some prisoners were so shocked they refused to eat at first, convinced the food was poisoned or that this was some elaborate psychological torture. British guards had to actually encourage them, sometimes eating from the same pots to prove the food was safe. Make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell because the details of what happened next are even more incredible than you might imagine. Here's something that doesn't get talked about enough in World War II history: the moment when enemy combatants realize that everything they've been told about their opponents is a lie. These German soldiers had spent years, in some cases their entire adult lives, being fed Nazi propaganda about British decadence, weakness, and barbarism. They'd been taught that the British were racial inferiors, that their empire was crumbling, that they were cruel and vindictive. And then they arrive in Britain, defeated and vulnerable, expecting the worst, and they're treated with basic human decency, fed properly, given clean clothes, provided with medical care, housed in conditions that, while certainly not luxurious, were vastly superior to what many Allied prisoners experienced in German camps. The cognitive dissonance was profound. A Luftwaffe pilot, shot down over Britain in 1944 and captured, later wrote in his memoirs, "That first meal broke something inside me, not in a bad way, but it shattered everything I'd been told to believe. If the British could feed us, their enemies, the men who had bombed their cities, how could they be the monsters we'd been taught they were?" This wasn't just about food. It was about the fundamental difference in values between the Nazi regime and the democratic allies. The British weren't feeding these prisoners out of weakness or naivety. They were doing it because it was the right thing to do. Because even in war, even against an enemy as terrible as Nazi Germany, Britain held on to its principles. Now, let's be clear about something. This wasn't charity, and it wasn't limitless generosity. Britain itself was under strict rationing. British civilians were making do with limited food supplies. Every egg, every slice of meat, every pat of butter was carefully controlled. So why feed German prisoners so well? First, there was the Geneva Convention, which Britain took seriously even when Germany had repeatedly violated it. British leadership understood that maintaining the moral high ground wasn't just propaganda, it was essential to what they were fighting for. Second, there was a practical consideration. Well-fed prisoners were healthier, more cooperative, and could be put to work helping Britain's war effort and post-war reconstruction. Starving prisoners would only create disease, unrest, and more problems. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the British understood something profound. These German soldiers, while they had fought for an evil regime, were still human beings. Many were conscripts who'd had little choice. Treating them decently wasn't about forgetting their crimes or forgiving the Nazi regime. It was about maintaining British values, even in the darkest of times. A British camp commander, interviewed after the war, put it succinctly: "We didn't feed them well because they deserved it. We fed them well because we're British, and that's what being British means. Even in war, especially in war, you don't abandon your principles." To truly understand how shocking this was for German POWs, you need to understand what conditions were like for Allied prisoners in German camps. British POWs in German camps subsisted on starvation rations, often just watery soup and a tiny amount of bread. Red Cross parcels, when they arrived, were sometimes the only thing keeping Allied prisoners alive. Thousands of British, American, and Commonwealth prisoners died from malnutrition and disease in German camps. Soviet prisoners had it even worse. The Nazis deliberately starved millions of them to death, viewing them as subhuman according to their twisted ideology. So when these German soldiers arrived in Britain and received proper meals, clean water, medical attention, and humane treatment, the contrast couldn't have been more stark. They were experiencing a level of decency that their own regime had systematically denied to Allied prisoners. And we're just getting started. Stick around because what happens next in Part 2 will show you exactly how this treatment transformed these prisoners and revealed the true character difference between the Allies and the Axis. The reality of life in British POW camps went far beyond that first shocking meal. What happened in the weeks and months that followed would fundamentally reshape how these German prisoners viewed the world, the war, and themselves. This is where the story gets truly fascinating, because we're not just talking about food anymore. We're talking about a systematic program of fair treatment that would have consequences neither the British nor the Germans fully anticipated at the time. Let me take you inside one of these camps. Camp 174 at Featherstone Park in Northumberland held thousands of German POWs. The daily routine was structured but not brutal. Prisoners woke at 6 in the morning to a breakfast that typically included porridge, bread, margarine, and tea. Real tea, not the substitutes they'd been drinking in Germany for years. Then came roll call, work assignments for those who volunteered, and throughout the day, regular meals that consistently shocked the new arrivals. Lunch might be a stew with actual chunks of meat, potatoes, and vegetables. Dinner followed a similar pattern. The daily caloric intake for German POWs in British camps was around 2,500 to 3,000 calories, which was actually more than what British civilians were getting under rationing, and vastly more than what these soldiers had been receiving in the final months of the war. One prisoner, a former tank commander named Friedrich, kept a secret diary that was later discovered and donated to a museum. His entries from the first month in captivity are remarkable. He wrote on his third day in the camp, "Again today, a full meal. I don't understand this. Hans thinks it's to fatten us up before something terrible happens, but I'm starting to believe this is simply how they treat prisoners. The guards are firm but not cruel. One of them even helped Werner to the medical station when his leg wound reopened. I can't reconcile this with what we were told." A week later he wrote, "I've gained weight. I can see it. My uniform actually fits properly now instead of hanging off me like a scarecrow. The man in the mirror looks less like a corpse. Today, a guard shared his cigarettes with us. I don't know what to think anymore." The medical care provided to German POWs was another aspect that completely contradicted their expectations. British military doctors and nurses treated wounded and sick German prisoners with the same professionalism they gave to British servicemen. Infections were treated with penicillin, a wonder drug that was still relatively new and certainly not available to average German soldiers during the war. Surgical procedures were performed when necessary, dental care was provided. One German prisoner, who had been suffering from a severe tooth infection for months, received proper dental treatment within his first week in captivity. He later said, "In the Wehrmacht, I would have just lost the tooth, probably gotten sepsis, and maybe died." The British dentist not only saved the tooth but apologized for the discomfort during the procedure. Apologized to me, a German soldier who had been shooting at his countrymen just weeks before. Work programs in the camps were voluntary at first, though later some became mandatory under the Geneva Convention's provisions allowing prisoner labor. German POWs worked on British farms, helped with construction projects, cleared bomb damage in cities, and assisted with various aspects of Britain's war effort and reconstruction. And here's the crucial part. They were paid for this work. Not much, but they received actual wages that they could use to buy small luxuries at the camp canteen: chocolate, cigarettes, writing paper, toiletries. After years of the Nazi economy and wartime deprivation, the simple act of earning money and choosing how to spend it was almost surreal for many prisoners. One prisoner worked on a farm in Yorkshire and later recalled, "The farmer's wife would bring us tea in the afternoon, tea and biscuits, while we worked in her fields. She knew we were German. She knew German bombers had killed people in nearby cities, but she brought us tea anyway. Her husband told us his son had been killed in North Africa fighting Rommel's forces. I didn't know what to say. But he just nodded and said, 'War is war, but you're here now, and you'll work honestly, I can see that.' I worked harder on that farm than I ever did in the Wehrmacht." The cultural and educational programs available to POWs were perhaps the most unexpected element of their captivity. British authorities established libraries in the camps, stocked with books in German, including works that had been banned by the Nazis. Prisoners could read Remarque, Heine, and other authors whose works had been burned in Germany. They could access newspapers and begin to learn the truth about what had really happened during the war. Film screenings were organized, though initially many prisoners refused to believe the footage of concentration camps that they were shown. The cognitive dissonance was too great. How could they reconcile the decent treatment they were receiving from the British with the horrific crimes their own nation had committed? It would take time, and not all of them would make that journey, but the seeds were being planted. Educational classes were offered. Prisoners could learn English, study trades, take correspondence courses. Some learned carpentry, others studied agriculture or mechanics. A Luftwaffe navigator started studying engineering through a British correspondence program while in captivity. He later used that education to build a successful career in post-war Germany and maintained lifelong correspondence with the British officer who had encouraged him to take the courses. In his letters, he repeatedly credited his time as a POW in Britain with saving his life, not just physically by feeding him, but mentally and morally by showing him a different way of thinking about the world. Religious services were another surprising element. The British provided German chaplains, allowed religious services, and respected the prisoner's faith. Catholic and Protestant services were held regularly. For men who had been told that the British were godless imperialists who would suppress their religion, this was yet another contradiction to process. One prisoner who had been a theology student before the war wrote to his parents, in a letter that was censored but preserved in archives, "They allow us to worship freely. The camp commander even arranged for a proper Christmas celebration. I sang hymns I haven't sung in years because they were considered too religious for the Nazi taste. What kind of enemy is this?" The relationship between guards and prisoners evolved in complex ways. Initially, there was obvious tension and hostility. These were men who had been trying to kill each other just weeks or months earlier. But over time, and this is where British character really shines through, many guards and prisoners developed a grudging mutual respect. There are documented cases of British guards teaching German prisoners to play cricket, of shared football matches, of guards helping prisoners write letters home to their families. One British guard, a veteran of the North Africa campaign who had every reason to hate Germans, later said in an interview, "I won't lie, at first I wanted nothing to do with them, but over time you see they're just men. Scared kids, many of them. Led astray by evil men in Berlin, but not necessarily evil themselves. I remember one young lad, couldn't have been more than 18, crying because he'd received a letter saying his mother had died in an Allied bombing raid. What was I supposed to do? I got him a cup of tea and sat with him. That's what you do. That's what being British means." The mail system was another example of British fairness. Prisoners were allowed to send and receive letters, though they were censored for security reasons, but the very fact that they could maintain contact with their families back in Germany meant everything to these men. Some hadn't heard from their loved ones in months or years. The British facilitated this communication, understanding that maintaining these human connections was important. Red Cross parcels sent from Germany to POWs in Britain were delivered, even when Red Cross parcels sent to Allied POWs in Germany were often stolen or withheld by German authorities. The contrast wasn't lost on anyone. Sports and recreation were actively encouraged. Football teams were formed, tournaments organized between different barrack blocks, chess competitions, card games, musical performances. A group of prisoners formed an orchestra and gave concerts. Another group put on theatrical performances, including some Shakespeare plays performed in German. The British authorities recognized that keeping prisoners mentally and physically active reduced tensions and made camp management easier. But it was more than just pragmatism. There was a genuine belief that even these enemy soldiers deserved to be treated as human beings with human needs for community, culture, and entertainment. If you're finding this story as fascinating as I do, make sure you hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what surprises you most about this treatment. Your engagement helps more people discover these incredible historical stories. The food continued to be a constant source of amazement. It wasn't just that the food was adequate, it was that it was often genuinely good. Camp kitchens were staffed by trained cooks, sometimes German POWs who had worked as chefs before the war. They were given decent ingredients to work with, better than what they'd had access to in Germany even before food shortages became severe. Birthdays were sometimes acknowledged with special meals. Christmas celebrations in 1945 and 1946 included traditional foods and festivities that many prisoners hadn't experienced in years. One prisoner recalled Christmas 1945 in a camp in Scotland where the British provided ingredients for the Germans to cook traditional German Christmas dishes.
They gave us what we needed to make Stalin and Sauerbraten. On Christmas Day, British guards wished us frohe Weihnachten. Some even joined us for the meal. I thought about my family in Hamburg, probably starving in the ruins of the city while I sat in captivity eating better than I had in 5 years. The guilt was overwhelming, but so was the gratitude.
The gradual ideological shift that occurred in many prisoners is one of the most significant long-term impacts of this treatment. When you're consistently shown that everything you were told about your enemy is false, when your lived experience contradicts years of propaganda, something has to give. Not all prisoners underwent this transformation. Some remained committed Nazis who viewed British kindness as weakness or as some kind of trick. But many others began to question everything they'd been taught. They began to ask themselves difficult questions. If the British were capable of such decency toward their enemies, what did that say about the regime they had fought for? If these racially inferior people treated them better than their own superior government had, what did that say about Nazi ideology? These questions didn't have easy answers, and wrestling with them was painful, but it was necessary. The British didn't just provide physical necessities, they provided something perhaps even more important. A model of how a democratic society functions even under extreme stress. These prisoners witnessed British guards following rules and procedures, saw officers being held accountable, observed a system that, while not perfect, operated according to law rather than arbitrary cruelty. For men who had served in a military where brutality was often rewarded and mercy was weakness, this was revelatory. The German military hierarchy in the camps reflected the Wehrmacht and SS structure they'd known, but they were living under British rule that demonstrated a different way of organizing society. Some prisoners paid close attention and learned lessons they would carry back to Germany. The re-education programs implemented in later years of the occupation became more formal and structured, but the foundation was laid through this basic decent treatment. You can't re-educate someone who sees you as a cruel oppressor, but when someone has experienced your fairness, your adherence to principles even when it would be easier and cheaper to abandon them, they're more likely to listen to what you have to say. The British understood this, perhaps not all at once or with complete awareness of the long-term implications, but they understood that how they treated these prisoners would have consequences beyond the immediate moment. The transformation wasn't uniform or universal, but it was real. Young soldiers who arrived as committed believers in National Socialism left as questioners, skeptics, or outright converts to democratic principles. The process was gradual and often painful. Imagine having your entire worldview dismantled, not through force or propaganda, but through simple, consistent, decent treatment. One prisoner described it as death by kindness, but meant it in the most positive way. They killed the Nazi in me not with bullets or beatings, but with tea and fair treatment. Every decent interaction was another nail in the coffin of the ideology I'd been fed. By the time I was repatriated to Germany in 1948, I was a completely different person than the one who had been captured in 1944. The contrast with what Allied prisoners experienced in German camps cannot be overstated and must be repeatedly emphasized because this is what made the British treatment so remarkable. British, American, and Commonwealth POWs in German camps faced systematic abuse, inadequate food, disease, forced labor under terrible conditions, and in many cases outright murder. The death rate for Allied POWs in German camps was significant. For Soviet POWs, it was catastrophic, with millions deliberately starved or worked to death. The Nazis had no intention of following the Geneva Convention when it came to prisoners they deemed racially or politically inferior. So the fact that Britain, even while its own soldiers were suffering in German camps, maintained its principles and treated German prisoners humanely speaks to something profound about British character and the values of democratic civilization versus totalitarian barbarism. There were practical benefits to this approach beyond the moral dimension. Well-treated German POWs provided valuable intelligence, cooperated with Allied authorities, and became ambassadors for democratic values when they returned to Germany. Some former POWs became leaders in building the new democratic West Germany after the war. They had seen firsthand how a free society operated, how it treated even its enemies with dignity, and they brought those lessons home. The investment in decent treatment paid dividends in the reconstruction of post-war Europe. Britain wasn't just winning the war, it was laying the groundwork for the peace, though this wasn't always the conscious intention at the time. The letters and diaries that have survived from this period paint a picture of gradual awakening and transformation. Men who arrived broken, starving, and terrified left healthier in body and often in mind. They had been fed not just food, but ideas. They had seen an alternative to the totalitarian nightmare they'd been a part of. Some embraced it fully, others rejected it, but none could unsee what they had witnessed. The power of leading by example, of showing rather than just telling, of treating others as you would wish to be treated even when they haven't extended the same courtesy to you, this is what Britain demonstrated during those years of holding German POWs. As we move toward our conclusion of this incredible story, you won't want to miss what happened when these prisoners finally returned home to a devastated Germany, and how their experiences in British captivity shaped the future of an entire nation. The final chapter of this story is coming up next, and I promise you it's going to tie everything together in a way that shows just how important those first meals, those first acts of decency, really were in the grand sweep of history. The ships and trains that carried German prisoners of war back to their homeland between 1946 and 1948 were filled with men who bore little resemblance to the broken, starving soldiers who had arrived in Britain years earlier. They were healthier, better fed, and many carried with them something far more valuable than the small possessions they'd accumulated during captivity. They carried memories of how they'd been treated, lessons about democracy and human dignity, and in many cases, a fundamentally altered understanding of the world. What happened when these men returned to a devastated, divided Germany would prove that those meals, that decent treatment, that adherence to principles, even in the darkest hours of war, had consequences that reached far beyond the barbed wire of the POW camps. Germany in 1946 and 1947 was unrecognizable to the men who had left it to fight. Cities lay in ruins, millions were dead, the country was divided and occupied, and the full horror of Nazi crimes was becoming undeniable as evidence mounted from the concentration camps and killing fields. The Germany these prisoners returned to was a nation facing an existential crisis of identity and morality. Into this chaos came hundreds of thousands of former POWs, each carrying their own story of captivity. Those who had been held in Soviet camps returned with tales of brutality, starvation, and death that reinforced every negative stereotype about the enemies Germany had made. But those who returned from Britain told a different story, one that many Germans initially found hard to believe. When Friedrich, the tank commander whose diary I mentioned earlier, returned to his hometown near Hamburg in 1947, his family almost didn't recognize him. Not because he looked worse than when he'd left, but because he looked better. He'd gained weight in British captivity. His teeth had been fixed. He was healthy. His mother wept when she saw him, having prepared herself for a skeleton like the ones returning from the Eastern Front. At the dinner table that first night, as his family shared their meager rations, Friedrich told them about the food in the British camps. They didn't believe him at first. How could the enemy have fed him better than his own government had fed them? But as more men returned with similar stories, the truth became undeniable. The British had treated their German prisoners better than the Nazi regime had treated its own people. The psychological impact of this realization rippled through German society in ways that are still being studied by historians today. For a population that had been told for 12 years that they were the master race, that their enemies were inferior and barbaric, the reality of British decency was profoundly destabilizing to Nazi ideology. If the inferior British could show such humanity, while the superior Germans had committed unspeakable atrocities, then everything the Nazis had taught was not just wrong, but inverted. Truth was the opposite of what they'd been told. This cognitive dissonance was painful, but necessary for Germany's moral and political reconstruction. Many former POWs became active participants in building the new democratic West Germany. They had seen democracy in action, had experienced the rule of law, had witnessed how a free society could function even under the extreme stress of war. When the Federal Republic of Germany was established in 1949, among its founders and early leaders were men who had spent time in Allied POW camps, particularly British ones. They brought with them lessons learned behind barbed wire about human rights, democratic governance, and the importance of treating even your enemies with dignity. The basic decency they'd experienced became a model they wanted to replicate in their own society. One particularly striking example was a former Wehrmacht officer named Klaus, who had been a mid-level bureaucrat before the war. He spent 3 years in a camp in Wales, where he took advantage of every educational opportunity offered. He learned English, studied British history and government, and participated in discussion groups about democracy and fascism. When he returned to Germany, he became involved in local politics in his hometown, eventually serving on the town council and then in the state legislature. In interviews late in his life, he always credited his time as a POW with teaching him what he called the essential lesson, that power must be constrained by law and morality or it becomes monstrous. He had learned that lesson not from textbooks, but from watching British guards follow rules, even when it would have been easier to not to, from experiencing a system that valued fairness over expedience. These stories these men told influenced not just politics, but culture and society. German writers and journalists who had been POWs wrote about their experiences, contributing to a broader cultural reckoning with the Nazi past and the construction of a new German identity. The contrast between British treatment of German POWs and German treatment of Allied POWs became part of the national conversation about guilt, responsibility, and the path forward. It was uncomfortable, it was painful, but it was necessary. You cannot build a better future without honestly confronting your past, and the testimonies of returning POWs made that confrontation unavoidable. Make sure you're subscribed because I've got more incredible, untold stories from World War II coming up that will absolutely blow your mind. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss them. The British policy of decent treatment also had practical diplomatic benefits in the emerging Cold War context. As the Western Allies and the Soviet Union moved from wartime alliance to Cold War confrontation, West Germany became a crucial potential ally. The fact that so many Germans had positive experiences with British and American captivity made it easier to build the alliance that would become NATO and the European Economic Community. Former German soldiers who might have been bitter enemies became partners in defending Western Europe against Soviet expansion. The seeds of that partnership were planted in POW camps where British guards had shown basic human decency to defeated German soldiers. The agricultural work programs had lasting impacts too. German POWs who worked on British farms learned modern farming techniques, built relationships with British farmers, and in some cases maintained those connections after repatriation. There are documented cases of British farmers and former German POW farm workers corresponding for decades after the war, sharing information about farming methods and maintaining friendships that transcended the enmity of war. One British farmer in Lincolnshire employed several German POWs during the war years and later sponsored one of them to return to Britain legally to work on his farm in the 1950s. That former POW eventually married a local woman and settled in Britain permanently, building a life in the country that had once held him captive. The question of forgiveness and reconciliation is complex and deeply personal, and it's important to acknowledge that not everyone in Britain supported the policy of treating German POWs well. There were British citizens who had lost loved ones to German bombs and bullets, who had suffered under the Blitz, who thought the Germans should be made to suffer in return. Their anger was justified and understandable. The British government's decision to uphold the Geneva Convention and maintain high standards of treatment for German POWs was not universally popular, especially when British civilians were themselves struggling under rationing and hardship. But British leadership understood something crucial. Revenge might satisfy in the short term, but it poisons the future. Breaking the cycle of violence and retribution requires someone to take the harder path of principled behavior, even when it's not immediately rewarding. This is where we see the stark difference between the Allied approach and the Nazi approach to war and its aftermath. The Nazis believed in total victory, or total destruction, in the subjugation or elimination of enemies, in revenge and racial hierarchy. The Allies, particularly the British and Americans, believed in the possibility of redemption, in the importance of maintaining moral standards even in war. in building a better peace rather than just winning the war. Those full plates of food served to hungry German POWs were not just meals. They were statements of principle. They were investments in a better future. They were demonstrations of what democratic civilization means in practice, not just in theory. The letters that some former POWs sent back to British camp commanders and guards years and even decades after the war are deeply moving documents. They express gratitude not just for physical survival, but for moral and intellectual awakening. One letter, written in careful English in 1965 by a former prisoner to the British officer who had commanded his camp, reads in part, "You saved my life twice. Once by feeding my body when I was starving, and once by feeding my mind when I was lost in darkness. I am now a teacher in my city, and I try every day to pass on the lessons you taught me about human dignity and democratic values. My students don't always understand why I speak so highly of the British, given that we were enemies. But I tell them, you were enemies who showed me what it means to be truly civilized. For that, I will be forever grateful." As Germany rebuilt in the 1950s and 60s, becoming an economic powerhouse and a stable democracy, the experiences of former POWs played a role in shaping the national character of the new federal republic. The economic miracle of post-war Germany is often attributed to Marshall Plan aid and German work ethic, and those factors were indeed crucial, but there was also a cultural and ideological foundation that made that recovery possible. Germans had to accept democracy, embrace human rights, reject militarism and authoritarianism. Many of the men who had experienced British captivity became evangelists for these values in their own communities. They had seen that there was another way to organize society, another way to treat people, and they wanted that for their own country. The British soldiers who served as guards and administrators in these POW camps were in many cases ordinary men doing an extraordinary thing. They were choosing to see the humanity in their enemies, to maintain professional standards even when facing men who had fought for a monstrous regime, to uphold British values when it would have been easier to abandon them. These weren't saints or heroes in the traditional sense. They were farmers, shopkeepers, factory workers, teachers who had put on uniforms to fight fascism. And when they were given responsibility for enemy prisoners, they chose to treat them as the British believed people should be treated, because that's what being British meant to them. That's the legacy of empire at its best, the values of fair play and rule of law that Britain tried, however imperfectly, to uphold. The story of German POWs being shocked by their first meal in British captivity is ultimately a story about the power of principles. It's about what happens when a nation committed to certain values actually lives up to those values even when it's difficult, even when it's expensive, even when it's not immediately rewarding. Those meals cost Britain resources it could barely spare. The humane treatment of German POWs required effort and expense that could have been directed elsewhere. But the long-term benefits, both moral and practical, far outweighed the short-term costs. Britain didn't just defeat Nazi Germany militarily, it defeated Nazi ideology by demonstrating a better way of being, a better vision of what human society could look like. When the last German POWs left British soil in 1948, they carried with them more than just their personal possessions. They carried memories of fair treatment, lessons about democracy, and in many cases, a determination to build something better in Germany. The barbed wire and guard towers of the POW camps have long since been dismantled. The men who were prisoners and guards have mostly passed away. But the impact of what happened in those camps, of those first shocking meals and the months and years of decent treatment that followed, continues to shape our world. The strong democratic partnership between Britain and Germany today, the European Union that has maintained peace on a continent torn apart by war, the shared values of human rights and rule of law that unite democratic nations, all of these have roots that reach back to moments when British soldiers chose to be better than their enemies, to uphold their principles even in the hardest of times. If you found this story as powerful as I did, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Next week, I'll be revealing another shocking story from World War II that you've probably never heard of before, and trust me, you won't want to miss it. This is the real victory of World War II. Not just military triumph, but moral triumph. Not just the defeat of an evil regime, but the vindication of a better way of living. Those German soldiers who couldn't believe their eyes when they saw their first full meal in British captivity were witnessing something more profound than they realized in that moment. They were seeing what it means when a nation truly believes in human dignity, rule of law, and democratic values. They were seeing the difference between a civilization worth defending and one that deserved to fall. And many of them took those lessons home and helped build a Germany that would never again threaten the peace of Europe. That's the power of a plate of hot food served with basic human decency. That's the legacy of British values in action. That's why this story matters, and why it should never be forgotten.
The decades that followed saw these former prisoners of war become bridges between Britain and Germany in ways large and small. Town twinning programs brought British and German communities together, often initiated or supported by men who had been POWs and wanted to maintain the connections they'd formed. Youth exchange programs allowed young Germans to experience Britain and young Britons to visit Germany, breaking down the walls of hatred and mistrust. Sports competitions, cultural exchanges, academic partnerships all flourished, in part because they were men on both sides who understood that the other side wasn't the monster that propaganda had painted. The former POWs who had experienced British fairness became ambassadors of reconciliation in their own right. In the 1970s and 80s, as historians began seriously studying the experience of POWs in World War II, the testimonies of German prisoners in British camps provided crucial evidence for understanding how the war ended and the peace began. Academic conferences brought together former prisoners and former guards to discuss their shared history. These meetings were often emotional. Men who hadn't seen each other in 30 or 40 years reunited. British guards met Germans they had supervised, now successful businessmen, teachers, politicians, grandparents. They shared memories, sometimes laughed, sometimes cried, always marveled at how much had changed and how important those years of captivity had been in shaping both individual lives and broader historical currents. The archival records from British POW camps reveal a bureaucracy that took its responsibilities seriously. Detailed records were kept of every prisoner, their health, their work assignments, any disciplinary issues, their mail, their requests and complaints. This wasn't just paperwork for its own sake, it was accountability. It ensured that camp commanders could be held responsible for how they treated their prisoners. It created a paper trail that historians could later use to understand what actually happened, as opposed to what propaganda or myth claimed happened. This commitment to proper record-keeping and accountability was itself a lesson in how democratic institutions operate, and German prisoners noticed it. They saw that British officers could be questioned, that there were procedures and appeals processes, that power was checked and balanced. These were not abstract concepts, but lived experiences that shaped how they thought about governance and authority. The spiritual and psychological recovery that many prisoners experienced in British camps is less discussed than the physical recovery, but it was equally important. Men who arrived broken, not just in body, but in spirit, who had witnessed horrors and committed acts they would spend lifetimes trying to process, found in the structure and fairness of camp life a kind of respite. It wasn't therapy in any modern sense, but the simple fact of being treated humanely, of having routines and rules that made sense, of being able to write to family and maintain human connections. All of this helped begin a healing process. Not every prisoner healed. Some carried their trauma and guilt to their graves, but many found in British captivity an unexpected grace period to begin coming to terms with what they'd been part of and who they wanted to be going forward. As we close this remarkable chapter of history, it's worth reflecting on what it teaches us today. In a world that often seems divided between those who advocate for justice and those who advocate for mercy, for punishment versus rehabilitation, for revenge versus reconciliation,
The story of German POWs in Britain shows that these aren't always opposing choices. The British provided justice by winning the war and holding the Nazi regime accountable, but they also provided mercy by treating defeated German soldiers with humanity. They punished the guilty, but didn't condemn entire populations to suffering. They sought reconciliation not as an alternative to accountability, but as a necessary complement to it. This both-and rather than either-or approach to post-war justice helped create the conditions for lasting peace in Europe. The meals that shocked German POWs were never just about food. They were about values, about what kind of society Britain was fighting to preserve and promote. Every plate served, every medical treatment provided, every fair hearing given, every educational opportunity offered was a statement about what the Allies believed civilization should look like. And because those values were consistently lived out day after day, year after year, in the mundane operations of POW camps across Britain, they had an impact that no amount of propaganda could have achieved. The British didn't have to tell German prisoners that democracy was better than fascism. They showed them through how they ran the camps, how they treated people, how they maintained standards even under stress. This is the story that needed to be told. Not because it makes anyone a hero or excuses anyone's crimes, but because it illuminates a path forward that the world desperately needed in 1945 and still needs today. How do you end cycles of violence? How do you build peace after devastating war? How do you help former enemies become partners? The British approach to German POWs, exemplified by that first shocking meal and the months of decent treatment that followed, provided at least partial answers to these eternal questions. You uphold your principles. You treat people with basic dignity. You invest in rehabilitation and education. You maintain faith that people can change, can learn, can become better than they were. And sometimes, often enough to matter, they do.